Grief and loss in our culture is often tough because no one talks about it, so few really know how to cope with it or even talk to the grieving. ADHD adds a layer of challenge to this. In this episode, we will explore the unique ways ADHD impacts the grief process, as well as how to cope with grief and loss. Without this work, grief and loss builds up over the years and can come out in unexpected ways, both emotionally and physically. You'll walk away from this episode with compassion for your grief journey, as well as clarity on how to grieve well to find joy even after loss. Be sure to listen. Welcome to the Self Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD-ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. So we're going to talk about grief and loss, and it's generally not a fun topic. Some might wonder, why would she do this? How is it relevant to ADHD? And we'll get to that. We'll talk about how this uniquely impacts ADHDers. And I want to talk about this today for several reasons. One, it's on my mind. My grandmother, whose 105th birthday would have been November 24th, 2024, died just a little less than 2 weeks prior. And so grief is on my mind right now. But more than that, as a clinical social worker, as someone who's also gone through grief and loss cycles, including the death of my mother nearly 6 years ago, I know what grief feels like with really hard loss, both personally, but also professionally. Because as I came to understand grief through my own experience, I was able to be more effective and really companion clients in their grief journey, so that I have been sitting with people in their own sadness, in their own pain. And I have a lot to offer about that. And last but not least, grief isn't really talked about. If there was any part of you that was like, why are we talking about that? Hopefully you're still listening. It isn't really talked about because it's uncomfortable. No one wants to think about people dying or losing something, right? It's not like a super fun topic, and yet it's a necessary one. It is something we all experience. We all experience it for sure with death. All of us will die, and our loved ones will all die. We may be around when some of them die. We may no longer be around when some of them die, but we are all going to experience loss and the grief that comes with it. And since my mother died in 2019, I have somewhat made it my personal mission, professional mission, to be very transparent about grief and to stay in conversation with people about it so that more and more people can know how to navigate what can be tricky times. Because here's the thing, no two people grieve exactly the same. And we'll get into that a little more. But this is such a unique experience, and yet there are similarities. So I wanted to create a space that we could unpack and explore some of these topics together. And I'll share some ideas on how to navigate this process if you're going through some grief and loss yourself. So I want to say there are many, many types of loss. So certainly today I'm focused on loss through death. And that's certainly a big thing for a lot of people. There are many other losses, whether divorce, loss of a business, loss of democracy, nervous laughter. But there's lots and lots of losses of what you thought things were. And this episode will apply to those different kinds of losses, though I will be primarily focusing on the death or some kind of loss of a loved one. You'll hear me say a lot death more than I will say loss. And I'll unpack that for a moment now. Here's the thing. I used to say when people would pass away or you lost someone, and I don't like that anymore since my mom died. And I'm going to tell you why. My mom is not gone. She's still with me, and I can feel her energy with me. And whether or not you have beliefs about people's souls or spirits or whatever else living on after this earth that we're on, whether or not you believe you can feel them, I believe I feel my mom. And worst case scenario, they live on in your heart. So to me, when someone dies, to say they're gone feels inaccurate. It also sucks. They're gone. But it doesn't honor that they are still with us in one way or another, depending on what it is that you believe. My mom is very present in my life still, and I can talk about that in another space. And so you'll hear me use words like death and died. And those are words that our culture has a hard time with. People prefer passed away. Even with our pets, we say cross the rainbow bridge because they're dead or they died is really hard. And some of that, I'm a yoga teacher. And one of the things we talk about in yoga is the kleshas, which are these veils that keep us from being connected to spirit, like the ultimate spirit, or some people might use the word God or consciousness or whatever strikes your fancy. But one of the kleshas is a binivesha. And a binivesha is pretty much living with the belief that we're not going to die, like not remembering that we're going to die. And it's actually an important veil to have because if every single day you remembered that you were going to die, it would be very hard to get out of bed and be like, okay, here we go. I'm going to go record my podcast. I'm going to do some really good social media content and I'm going to die. Like it just doesn't fit. So a lot of us, everyone pretty much to get through their days is not necessarily constantly thinking about death. Our brains do that so we can live. And sometimes we take it so far that we aren't able to inhabit spaces where someone has died. We aren't comfortable with the reality. We don't know what to say or how to be around people who've lost someone. I should see, there I go, lost, for whom someone has died. I believe it's really important that we get comfortable with this and be able to talk about it because it's something all of us will experience at one time or another. So, we're going to dig into it and talk about the ways that ADHD affects the grieving process. There's three big ways, and one is through unpredictable emotions. And I want to say this most people, I think, have unpredictable emotions with grief. What I believe might be slightly different with ADHDers, if not very different, we tend to feel things deeply. We tend to be highly sensitive folks. Maybe not all of us, but many. And so things like the death of someone hits us very, very hard. I remember when I was 15 and my grandpa died. I remember getting the call and screaming and crying, and I was out of control, upset. I didn't know what to do with those big feelings. First of all, because it was the 80s and no one taught their kids how to deal with big feelings. So it was like, there you go. But also, my feelings were bigger than what anyone knew what to do with because I feel things deeply. I feel joy deeply too. When I'm happy and excited, you can tell. And so this is one of the ways that grief can show up for us, and it can make us not want to deal with it because it can be big and it can be heavy. And so the important thing is to find ways to navigate. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but that might be one way that your grief shows up bigger. So if you're around people and you're crying super duper hard and they're crying, but you just seem so much more dysregulated and emotional, no one's better than the other. It's just our brains are unique and our sensitivity tends to mean that we feel things very, very deeply. You may also notice misdirected focus. So you might be hyper focusing on things unrelated to grieving. You might be hyper focusing on things unrelated to anything you need to do. So you may have these things you need to do for your business. It's happened to me today, actually, as I'm grieving the death of my grandma. I had things I needed to do, and all of a sudden I went down a rabbit hole of other tasks that I was super hyper focused on. And I was like, okay, wait a minute. Like, what am I doing? What am I doing? So that can be a way that it shows up. Also, isolation. Because our feelings are so big, we don't always feel super accepted by everyone else, especially the people throughout our life who have told us we're too sensitive or too much or whatever. Or maybe we've just internalized those messages. So some of us, like, there's an urge to isolate in general when someone dies, but also as people with big feelings, we might have learned to do that. And unfortunately, isolating when someone dies just adds to the loneliness and even the hopelessness of the grief. So it's important not to do that. And again, we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, actually, right about now. So I want to shift into talking about coping. And as we do that, the number one thing I want to point out is that no two grief experiences are the same for the same person or between people. So, what I mean by that is my sister and I, both of our moms died. We're 2.5 years apart. We had very unique grief experiences from each other. It's just how it is. We have also very different lives. She has 2 kids and a spouse, and I am child free by choice and was in a partnership at that time and am no longer partnered. And so our grief experiences look very, very different, especially because when I was partnered, that person couldn't handle seeing me cry at all. So that impacts it. It's going to look different. Whereas this time we both lost our grandmother and it looks different. It's bringing up the loss of our mom and or death of our mom, right? See the language, but it's bringing up the death of our mom. And also we experience our grandmother's death in unique ways. And I can also tell you that I experience the death of my grandma as very different from the death of my mom, very different from the death of my beloved and dogs from childhood over the years, and very differently from my grandpa when I was 15. So grief is unique as a thumbprint. It's going to be different for every single person, every single time. And that's essential to understand so that you're not comparing yourself as, oh my gosh, I'm doing it wrong, or oh, they're doing it wrong. Or if you know someone who's grieving that you think they're doing it wrong, everyone grieves in their own way. Everyone grieves in their own way. And so it's important to understand that there's so many variables that can impact this. The person who died, your relationship with them, how they died. My mom died quickly. We didn't know she was going to die. She was just past her 70th birthday. She died in a surgery that wasn't supposed to kill her. So it was very sudden, unexpected, and tragic. My grandma has been in a transition phase of dying for 3 weeks, or had been till she died. So it those are very different experiences. So how they die is different. The relationship you have with them might change it if you had a good relationship, a not good relationship. I have some clients who are estranged from their parents, and when they die, they have an experience. And so so that plays a factor, how old the person was when they died, where you're at in your own social emotional growth has an impact, like what kind of a pre-existing coping skills you have. All of it plays a part in in contributing to what your grief experience is going to be. And there's no right answer. It's just like how it is. So I share that so that you can hold yourself with compassion and maybe hold others with compassion as we all go through our unique grief journeys. So I also want to say you never really get over grief. There's never like a moment where you completely get over, especially a deep loss. There's no you're not like healed where you're completely happy all the time about it. You're never gonna be happy that this person died unless they did really harmful things. That might be a different situation. Generally speaking, most people are not going to get to a place where they feel like their grief is healed and they're fully recovered, and you might feel better. And there will be times when you think of your deceased loved one and it will still bring up stuff. It's possible if you didn't know someone very well that it's not going to be as big of a response. Certainly, no, I was going to say my great grandma, although my great grandma was awesome. That woman, like my mom's mom, she was awesome. She would give us little treats for Dairy Queen with and be like, "Don't tell your parents. Shh, shh." And she'd give us like a dollar. It was so cute because a dollar back then could buy things. But even her, she died when I was in 4th grade, and I'm now 50, so do the math, it was about 40 years ago. And while I won't sob anymore thinking about her death, I can still feel the sadness. So it's not that you necessarily get over it, it's just that you learn how to weave the death, weave the grief into the fabric of your life. And the more connected you were to that person, the more significant that person was in your life, maybe even the longer you knew them, like in the case of my mom, that one I don't ever expect to, like, I don't expect to get to the same place with my mom's death as I am with my great grandma. First of all, she died when I was like 10, almost 11, so there's that, but also it's a different relationship. So I just want you to know that you don't have to be at this place where you're going to get over it, that it's actually completely healthy to instead recognize that you will always miss this person, assuming you had a positive relationship, that there may always be layers of sadness there, and that when someone else significant dies, it may stir all that stuff up, as is true right now for me and my sister, and actually my whole family, because this was my mom's mom who just died. So just know that the grieving process is about working through the feelings, is about reconciling the loss, making sense of it in your life, and then weaving this into the new version of life because it's different than what you expected. I kind of knew my grandma was going to die soon. She was going to be 105, but that's not always true. You don't always, your expectations of your life with someone isn't always met if they die younger than you expected. So, all right. Next, I want to talk about the misconceptions of the stages of grief because when we are grieving, a lot of us have heard about the stages of grief, which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed, but they were not developed based on people's grieving experience after someone they loved died. The 5 stages of grief were actually never meant to be linear, and they were developed by observing people who had terminal illness, observing what it was like for them dying. So it was really their grief process. And so she talked about the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance relative to them. And it kind of got transferred into this is everyone's grief process. And so I basically just want to let you know that you will probably experience denial, although denial didn't fit for me. Like when my mom died, it wasn't so much denial as disbelief. It was like, especially because it was so sudden, and this is really common when there's a sudden death, it's like, "Did that really happen? Is she really dead?" That lasted for several years where every once in a while I'd be like, "Is she really dead?" And sometimes we'd even ask my partner, I'm like, "I remember going to the memorial, I think," and not because I have a really good memory, it's just that it was foggy, which is something else that happens with grief, is right after a death, you can have some call it grief brain. You can have some fogginess to your brain. It can be hard to focus. I experienced that pretty intensely for the first 6 months after my mom's death, and 12 months, it was still I wasn't quite back to where I normally am. Although then I was heading into perimenopause, so it's hard to know it's hard to know what was causing the fog at that point. ADHD, perimenopause, or the death of my mom. So there's that. But denial might feel like denial. It might feel like disbelief or like, really? Did that happen? Is that real? Really? Is this what happened? And that's probably more common for people when it was a surprise. But it's not something, again, these stages, the word stages is inappropriate. I would call them the 5 experiences of grief, 5 common experiences or things that pop up, because these are things I could experience all at in one day. I would go from disbelief and then to deep sadness, and then I'd be pissed as hell. So it's just, it can all happen in one day. Anger is common. Anger at the person who died, anger at the world, anger at God or whatever it is that you believe in. Anger is a super common experience. Bargaining, we talk about, and I didn't notice a lot of this with my mom, but I was like, because it was very clear she was dead. She was not dying when I knew it. So there wasn't really much bargaining, but I was like, maybe if I do this, she'll come back. And some of it, it felt like younger parts of me thinking those kind of things because it wasn't really logical. But there was some bargaining in my head. I didn't experience that as much. Some people experience it more. Again, it's all unique. Depression is common, and some people might not describe that as clinical depression. Some people might. It just depends what it looks like. Certainly, there's a sadness. Certainly, there is a heaviness. And again, if this person was really wicked to you in life, you might not feel that at all. You might actually feel some relief. Or even with my grandma, she was transitioning for about 3 weeks. They were like, "Okay," on a Wednesday, they were like, "Yeah, she probably only has a few days left." And she lived 3 weeks more. Well, just shy of 3 weeks. So she lived 19 more days. So there was some relief there, like, okay, I'm glad because it was hard. It was hard being in that place of anticipatory loss. You knew it was going to happen. You didn't know when it was going to happen. You know it would happen soon ish. So it's just that anticipatory loss is really hard. So relief can be an experience, though it's not, again, it's not one of the 5 stages of grief that Kubler-Ross identified when she was studying cancer patients or terminally ill people. So you may or may not experience that. If someone was wicked to you during your life, if they really, really mistreated you, you may have some relief that you don't have to deal with them anymore. And you might also feel sad at the same time, right? I'm noticing my grandma was lovely. She was a lovely woman. My mom was too. And I'm noticing something outside of this, which is this weird emptiness. That level of that generation of our family is all dead. She was the last one, obviously. She was like just about 105. So, but I'm noticing that. So for those of you, I have a really good friend who's had some loss, and I believe all of her aunts and uncles have died, and her parents are deceased, and grandparents a while ago. And so for her, she's the oldest generation, and we're like 50. So there can be this weird emptiness around. There's not that, like, it almost feels like this extra veil of protection of the elders. I don't know. But that's something I'm noticing. And again, that's outside of the stages of grief or the experiences of grief. One that people talk about a lot is acceptance. And it definitely is the 5th experience that Kubler-Ross noticed. And I will say I have moments of acceptance of my mom's death, especially now that we're going on 6 years, and not always. So acceptance is not the goal. Acceptance is not a place you land. To me, what it is weaving this into part of your life. Yeah. My mom loved Christmas. So Christmas will always have a little bit of sadness mixed in with it. as I remember her. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's human, and I think it's important. And eventually, we get to some moments of acceptance. Okay, yep, I can't call her and tell her that cool thing. Although someday I really wish someone would invent a server that lets you leave voicemail messages for your loved ones that has their old message like, "Hi, it's Ellen. Leave a message." And then you could leave a message and then, I don't know, they can delete them. It doesn't matter. You feel like you're calling your parent without having to keep their cell phone service going forever. I don't know. It'd be a cool idea. But acceptance is one of those experiences. So, as far as how to move through this, I just shared about so many different experiences you can have inside of the grief process. And I'm sure there are many, many more. One thing I notice in some of my clients who have had their parents die, parents who abused them, is there's actually some sadness that their parents will never come around, that they will never get an apology, they will never get a even a recognition that they did what they did. And even that finality can be really hard. So again, whatever you're experiencing is important. And it's important that you allow yourself to actively mourn. So often in our culture, we someone dies, everyone's there for them for the first month. If it's someone like your mom, everyone's there for you like for the first 3 to 6 months. And then kind of after that, definitely after a year. On the year anniversary, everyone's still there. And then it's okay, come on, let's move on. I will say my experience is different. Almost all of my friends are therapists and yoga teachers or people who have lost their parents young. So that was not my experience. But my understanding is people's common experience is that people expect them to hurry up and grieve. And I will tell you, even my therapist training, it the DSM back when I was in grad school, granted it was over 20 years ago now, but when I was in grad school, eh, the DSM said that anything over a year is considered complicated bereavement. So like that wasn't supposed to happen. So to me, even diagnostically, there's this idea that people should be quote unquote over it within a year. And so I just want to speak to some truth to bullshit here and just say that is not accurate, that it will take as long as it takes. And there is some benefit to actively mourning. And what does that look like? So for me, what it looked like with my mom, I got a new journal. It had a sloth on it because she and I used to love to watch the sloths at Como Park and the Como Zoo rather, and in St. Paul. And it had a sloth on it, and I would write to her. I put a couple pictures of her in it, and I would write to her every night, probably for the first 6 to 12 months after she died. And I still will occasionally write to her, although now I have a second journal, or my third, I can't remember, but I found that incredibly healing, and then I could cry, and I would sit and cry and write and cry and write. I also listened to some Hertz music for grief. I found that really helpful while I was doing the writing. And for me, that was what active mourning looked like. It also looked like on my way to work, I'd let myself cry, especially for that first 3 to 6 months when it was it was like all right there. Not that I didn't ever feel like crying on the way to work or didn't allow myself to cry on the way to work after that. It's just that that first 3 to 6 months, it was really intense. So I'd cry on my way to work. Sometimes I'd cry between clients, and then I'd cry on my way home from work. So letting yourself have the feelings you have, letting yourself have the feelings that you have. I noticed for me, because my mom and I had such a positive relationship, especially the last 15 years of her life, when I got to feeling angry that she died, I had a part of me that felt really angry that she left us. And then I had a part of me that felt guilty that I was angry at her for dying. And so that was an interesting layer of grief to actively work through. And I will tell you, doing that work, it was hard. That was hard to do. It was hard to sit with those feelings. It was hard to be with those feelings day after day. And I'm so glad I did because now, nearly 6 years later, I can be here and talk about it and help others and not fall apart. That's not to say I don't have moments where I still cry. If I go to the niche where her ashes are, I certainly break down. I'm just not feeling as lost anymore. It's just kind of part of my life. Like, oh, okay, sometimes I'm going to cry because I miss my mom. And I'm sure it will be that way to some degree with my grandma. So, whatever it is that you need to do to actively mourn, I really, really recommend you do it. And not just me, I'm not a grief expert. Alan Wolfelt has a book called, oh gosh, now all of a sudden it's out of my brain. Understanding Grief, maybe? I'll put it in the show notes. And he talks about this. That's actually a decent book because it's got touch points. I think there were touchstones. I think there's 10 of them. And so there were very small chapters with little pullouts and things. So right after someone dies, reading can be really hard. So I, of course, as a therapist, when something happens in my life, how do I approach it? Oh, okay, I'm going to read all the books about it and then treat myself because obviously I still went to therapy. But I read his book and then I read others. And he talks about that active mourning process and how important it is so that this doesn't get stored in your body. And so that those feelings, you're going to have better access to them closer to the time of death than if you wait. Certainly, sometimes you're not going to be able to work through it. One of my closest friends, her mom died when she was in her 30s. She had very young children at the time. And she couldn't do what I did. I would spend an hour every night sitting there crying and writing to my mom. Not everyone can do that. And so it's going to look different for everyone. And it's important to try your best to find some time to let yourself cry, even if it's just in the car on your way to work or the grocery store. I also will tell you getting comfortable with crying in public was really a good thing. I figured out how to do at that point. I know a lot of us ADHDers have rejection sensitive dysphoria, so we can fear rejection. In some ways, I don't know that as a choice. I sometimes would just break down. I remember my first day back to Colorado. She was in Minnesota. I was in Colorado at the time. And my first day back to Colorado, I put money in a parking meter to go get Caribou coffee. And as I walked into Caribou Coffee, I broke down. I lost it. Because my mom, I mean, first of all, I love Caribou Coffee, but also my mom used to give me Caribou Coffee gift cards when she was thinking of me as a special treat. So I just broke down and missed her. And then I was in the Caribou where I always was. So the people there knew me. And it was unfortunately a scene. They were all very sweet and supportive and came out and hugged me. And it was awesome. But it was still, you get comfortable breaking down in public. And I'm not gonna lie, I was embarrassed at first, and then it was like, "You know what? This is just gonna be how my life is right now. Sometimes I'm gonna cry in public, and it's just how it is, and it's another way to work through it," right? The other thing that when someone dies or when you have a big loss, whatever it is, it's important that you get extra rest and extra care for yourself over and above what you normally do. I normally am good on 8 hours of sleep. Right after my mom died, I needed 9, sometimes 9.5. It's important that you are letting yourself rest because what has happened is a very big hit to your system and you need rest. And this is just my personal opinion. This isn't documented in evidence, but to me, I'm noticing the older I am, maybe it's perimenopause, the more I need that rest. So just figure out what you need. Give it to yourself. Have some compassion for yourself. Hold yourself with some love and grace. And last but not least, what is really, really essential following the death of a loved one and throughout the rest of your life, really, is to create a support network. It may be that some of your closest friends are able to do that. And it may be that those are not the people that you can talk about the death with. Some people can't go there. I was fortunate in the sense that most of my friends are therapists, yoga teachers, and or have lost their parents young. So all of my friends were like, "Yep, we're here. Awesome, no problem." And sometimes they didn't know what to say and or do. And so to make it easier on them, I would just tell them what I needed. I would ask. They don't have to do anything. It's not like you're demanding, but just saying, "Hey, you know what? It would really help me right now if you could listen. Do you have some time to just listen?" Or, "Hey, can I don't know that I ever sat and cried to any of them, but when I was having a really hard day, sometimes I would just text one of my friends and be like, "Oh my gosh, this was going through my head. I just need you to validate. I know you can't fix this. I just need you to validate." And then they could do that. They would show up. And it might feel weird if you're not used to having asking to have your needs met. Although I will say with ADHD, I think a lot of us end up doing that because we tend to put more into our relationships than other people because we're so sensitive, we're tuned in. So sometimes we actually have to ask people to support us, which is not necessarily the case in my situation because most of my friends are also highly sensitive. But I found it helpful to ask clearly what I thought I needed. I had one friend I will always remember. We still do this now, even though it's been 6 years. When she wouldn't know what to say, but she was thinking of me some morning or something, she would send me 3 hearts in a text message. And I knew that it meant, "I love you, I'm thinking of you, and I'm here for you," or some variation of that. And even that was enough. So sometimes just even asking your friends that when they're thinking of you to send you a heart emoji or something can be really, really useful. The important thing is that you not isolate because it will make all of this so much harder. And if you're like, but Jen, none of my friends get it. I don't have anyone in my life who gets it. Then it's really, really important that you get into a grief group. I went to a grief group. I went for, I don't know if I went 5 sessions. Let's see, it was like 13 sessions. I think I went 5. And there were a lot of things about it that I found really, really helpful. What I didn't find helpful is that the facilitator was not very good at group handling a group dynamic. And I don't know if that's common with grief groups, but I will say not all grief counselors are trained therapists, so they may not have group therapy experience, and all trained therapists don't either. So, as someone who's offered group therapy in an intensive outpatient setting, I had a really hard time with the way the group was handled and some people getting to talk for half an hour and then other people not getting their turn. And one person specifically targeting me a lot with negative commentary. I don't know what that was about, but whatever. I just lost my mom. I can't even keep track of what her problem was. But my point is, not all grief groups are like that. And there can be help in that. And some people meet some of their, dare I say, grief buddies in a group like that. So let yourself be in community in some way. Let yourself be helped. Let yourself be loved. And bottom line, let yourself actively mourn. So this is a big topic and I hope it was helpful to you. And if you're like, I haven't had anyone who died and you're still listening, awesome, because this will help you someday when you do. So my heart is with you if you're going through the grief process yourself. And I would love it if you know someone who's grieving, especially if they have ADHD, because we talk about the difference there. But if you know someone who's grieving, having a hard time, you're welcome to share this with them. I would love it if you shared it so they can feel supported and seen and have some ideas. And in the show notes, I will put uh, some of the titles of the books that I read that I found helpful. I will tell you that I found these helpful, but I have different clients who say, "Oh my god, that one was terrible," or, "Ooh, this one was great. Oh, that one was awful." And so just with a grain of salt to know that just like everyone's grief experiences is unique as a thumbprint, remembering everyone comes in with different coping skills, that what is helpful is going to be unique as well. So I'm going to share the books that I read personally, and you can decide for yourself if they are a fit for you. So there's, again, anytime I recommend a book, I'm like, no book is for everyone, and not every single word in the book needs to be taken as the way to do it forever and ever, whatever. Right. So it's just what someone is putting on a page. And that may or may not help. And you get to decide for yourself, does this resonate with me right now? If not, discard. All right. Please share, please follow, and I'll see you next time. Take care.